Hey, everybody. Welcome to Etherealogy Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about grief. And you might wonder, what does grief have to do with spirituality? And we feel like it has everything to do with spirituality. This is what has brought us to wanting and desiring a deeper understanding of what more is there beyond life. So we thought we'd just talk about our personal experiences of dealing with loss and grief, but also as professional mediums, what we have noticed and seen among people who are grieving. And that's going to be the subject of today's episode. So I just want to start off by um, seeing if you guys want to tell anything about your stories of your grief journey and how it brought you to maybe a new understanding or just a different understanding of life after life.
Yeah, I think grief is a really important subject, and obviously because we're mediums, so we communicate with people in spirit. We have a lot of grief always in that, and we've all experienced our own form of personal grief, and so especially with the holidays coming up, or anytime there's a monumental occasion like a birthday or a wedding or something monumental.
Mm-hmm.
I think as mediums and as working in the spiritual field, if you will, we do get a lot of questions about it. And in my own experience, I think there's a lot you can do as the person in grief and equally supporting somebody else that's in grief. I know for me, when I lost my spouse, grief is a very muddy place to be. Like, it feels almost surreal and it feels heavy. And so when I was new to grief, I really appreciated people that wouldn't ask me what I needed or stuff like that, because I don't even know what's happening. This is not even real to me, being new in grief. So people that would just step up and do things that were helpful, whether it's a meal or send a card or whatever it is, just knowing that they're there thinking about me during that time was like really, really helpful. There's things also that people mean well, and if they haven't experienced grief at a deep level, maybe they just don't know, and they might say things that could actually be harmful, like, oh, they're in a better place, or don't worry, you have more, you can always get married again, or like, people don't know. I feel like overall, like, people, it's kind of an ignorant thing to say. So I think a blanket statement would be to not say any of those things. If you don't know what to say to support somebody in grief, just be there for them or just listen, because you're not going to fix it. Nobody's going to fix it. It's a journey, and it's something that just needs to be worked through on a personal level. And that is different for everybody. But when I think about the holidays and the things that would really help is if somebody would talk about my person. People also can be afraid to talk about the person that you lost. And if people would tell stories or share a picture or a thought, like from a spiritual perspective, that brings the energy and the essence of that lost, that past loved one, in that moment, and you can really feel them. This subject, there's so many things. You can do rituals. Okay. I'm going to leave it at that for now and see what Anthony has to say, because I could just start. Yeah. Anthony, do you have...
I didn't know where to start, but actually then you said the word deep, and then I realized with grief, there's different levels. And like, it's not to diminish it for anyone, but obviously if you lose a spouse, if you lose a friend, parent, a child, there's different levels of grief. I think they're depending on your connection to that person. So I always just try to remind myself, if, let's say, I even meet someone who's in whatever stage of grief, like, I don't assume or presume that I know what they're going through or what stage of grief they're at. And like you said, Trizzy, sometimes I'm like, I won't say something because I can be very logical. In other words, I want to tell them about spirit, and I want to tell them that, like, they haven't gone forever. But sometimes I have to refrain from that because it could be insensitive in the moment, And just because I, let's say, went and wanted to understand all of that after my father passed, because I wanted to know what happens, where are they, etc. Like, that might have been my way of coping with grief. I don't presume then that's going to work for somebody else. So I don't push that on anyone. That's the one thing that if it's going to irritate me is I met a friend there recently who's literally in deep grief, and they tell me that people come up and they speak different things. Like someone might be insensitive. People can just say something and mean well, and it just doesn't come across that way, right? But they never meant to hurt that person. So like that's one side. Then you've other people telling her like, oh, would you not pick yourself up? Like it's time to move on. It's that type of stuff. I'm like, just say nothing.
Yeah.
You know the phrase, if you've nothing nice to say, don't say nothing at all. So like when it's that type of comment, I'm like, just keep it to yourself.
Well, I feel like people say stuff like that because they are uncomfortable with your
Yes.
grief.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, in other words, can you please stop doing this around me because I'm uncomfortable and I don't know what to say to you? And
Mhm.
so then that's the case where maybe you do remove yourself for a little bit, but you could send a card to them. You could still let that person know you're thinking of them, even if you are the one who's uncomfortable with them,
Yeah.
with the grief and being around that, because it is hard to be around somebody who's grieving, and we're empaths as in general, and we pick up other people's emotions and we feel for them. And when we're not in that state of grief ourselves, it can be feeling like we're being pulled towards that rather than feeling like I'm being pulled towards that person because they need some warmth and some love and some of that extra that I have to give at this moment. People just don't necessarily look at it that way. So I always tell people your grief is your own to go through, and don't let anybody else tell you how to do it or when they think you need to move on. And I don't even like the phrase move on. So I like the phrase moving forward.
Yeah.
So I like to tell people it's just step by step that we get through this grief, and your loved ones are moving forward with you. So they're always around with us. So we can feel like we're not leaving them behind, because a lot of people worry like, if I go resume anything normal about my life, I'm leaving my loved one behind. But you're not leaving them behind. You're moving along with them. You're each on a new journey now. So I think it's important to know that spirit is with us on this journey.
That's what I want them to know, that I don't want to be
Yeah.
insensitive. You know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
you want to tell them that just because you know that to be true.
Right.
That's a really great segue for talking about what we can give some insight on from a spiritual perspective as mediums. Like, what can you do to help support people in grief on the spiritual thing to show them that their people are still around? Like for me, like you hear like a lot of people will light a candle or talk to your person in spirit out loud or in your head about what you're doing for that holiday, and you can ask them for signs. There's a lot of different options to celebrate who they are and also bring you closer to connecting with them in the spiritual sense also during the holidays and important times. Do you have any thoughts about that, Carol? Any ideas?
Well, I know that for me, when those occasions come up and, I don't want to celebrate in the usual way or the ways I used to, then I find something new to do. And sometimes it's honoring them with participating in what was their favorite stuff. So what was their favorite meal? Might have that. What was their favorite movie? I'll watch that. And or even a place to go. If they liked hiking, I'll go for a hike. If they liked a movie, I'll go to the movie. So it just becomes about starting something new, but that I still feel like I am still with them and they are with me, because it is something they would have enjoyed, and they're not there at that moment, but I can still enjoy it too. And I think it's important for people to understand it's not bad to still enjoy something, even in your grief. And I think that we tend to hold ourselves back from saying, if I'm grieving, I'm not allowed to laugh at ever. I'm not allowed to do something that brings me a smile. I'm not allowed to have any kind of enjoyment. And I think it's hard to navigate allowing yourself to do any of those things while still being in grief, because it feels like, am I moving on? But understanding that, no, I'm moving forward. And that's a different thing altogether.
But you're also like, so you do an activity that they enjoyed. Like you're honoring them, right? And obviously make sure you enjoy it as well,
Oh, well, yes. I mean, I'm not going
Just
skydiving or anything.
like he'd love to jump out of planes, but I
Yeah.
just can't do it.
Absolutely not.
So like, pick an activity you like as well. I like think that's lovely that you honor them. When you do something for a loved one in spirit, I often think that it's almost like sending them an SMS, a message. They almost get a little bing or something that something is happening, let's say in the human realm, to do with them. And often we in readings will come through that, an event is coming up and that loved one is very much present in spirit. So it's not that they're not there physically anymore. It's the new form. So you can also honor them and they can be with you, let's say, in that form. And I think it's lovely then when you turn, what is a tragic life situation into an experience that maybe you even start looking forward to every year. Say he's into hiking. You never went hiking, and then suddenly you say, oh, look, I'm going to go hiking. And then actually you find out you love hiking. Like, that's a really nice thing. Let's say that you discovered out of such a sad situation.
I see that a lot with people who come to me for a reading, that they will say, oh, well, he loves the guitar, so I'm taking guitar lessons, or he was such a great artist, so I've been playing with the paints, or, whatever it is that they left behind. So that is one way, but other people will have a way of just like, we leave an extra chair at the table for them, or I hung a stocking for them, and kind of marking a place that they're still around and going at it about that way. So it doesn't even have to be a physical activity that you're doing. It could just be something that you're offering or marking.
Yeah. I think it's also important to mention that if you're the person in deep grief, like, don't put too much pressure on yourself to do any of these things if you're not ready for it. It's like, there's somebody supporting you in that, maybe let them know ahead of time, like, hey, Thanksgiving's going to be really hard for me this year. If I disappear in the bedroom, can you cover for me? Like, find people that your people want to help you. So, really tell the people ahead of time that you're closest to that you may disappear for a while, and that's okay. Like, there's no linear timeline on grief, but people in your life is important. Like, you don't have to go through it alone. So I think that if you could find one or two buddies to tell, like, hey, this might be too hard for me to hear this or whatever, can you have my back during this? It's okay to ask for that as well. And so if you're somebody supporting somebody in grief, you could ask them questions like that. If the holidays are coming up, like, hey, I know this is going to be hard. Do you want me to kind of run? Like, I'll be your wingman this Halloween or this Christmas or, Hanukkah, whatever. And if I see you getting overwhelmed, don't worry about it. Like, you can also support people in grief that way. And so then if you're the person grieving, allow yourself to have that time, because self-care is so important on the healing process with grief. And part of that self-care is letting people help you, and then understanding that there's no set timeline, but just really feeling like you're getting that support and allowing it to happen can be really beneficial as you move forward through your grief onto healing.
And I think I like what you said about, asking a friend or family member to do this specific thing, help you out in that way. Sometimes we don't always know what that is. So if you are the supporter, I found it really nice when people would say, hey, can I go to the store for you? Hey, can I cut the grass for you? When they gave a specific thing.
Yeah.
Yes, you can, because
Yeah.
it's, even though you're grieving, you don't want to necessarily ask somebody when they say, what can I do for you? You don't want to say, hey, can you go do my shopping for me? That'd be great. But if they offer, then that would actually be great. So having a specific thing to offer is very helpful as well.
I would be the type that would give an open-ended offer, Let me
Most
know if
people
there's
are.
anything. Yeah, and obviously they've, good intentions behind that. But like you said, then people might even in grief won't think, let's say, straight off the bat, shit, I need to cut the grass, that type of way.
Right. It's those things that you let pile up because you can't face day-to-day stuff, at that moment. So if you could come vacuum my floors, that'd be awesome.
Yeah,
Or
totally.
I'll
do
not be
that.
offering to hoover your house or vacuum or whatever the Christ you want. We're like, no, unless you've a sit more that I can go around the grass with.
I will let you do that.
Yeah, I remember not even knowing what I needed, and like a girlfriend came and did all my dishes, and then somebody came and walked the dog like every day, and I was like, I was such in a daze that like I was so appreciative of that, because I didn't know what I needed, like you said. And so I think when you find that person that will do those things for you, and you don't know what you're going to need during Thanksgiving or a Christmas dinner, you could say to the people that have stepped up, like, hey, I don't know what I need, but if you can just keep an eye on me and cover for me, that's also helpful if I need to disappear or whatever. Yeah.
Patricia, you're all about support, right? And everything that you say there is like to support somebody or to support yourself or vice versa. But then there's always going to be the people who say something they shouldn't say. And I think it's important then, that Carol alluded to as well earlier on, if you have an experience with someone that says something that's insensitive or tells you to move on, or that, it should be happening quicker, blah, 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 just realize that 9 out of 10 times somebody says that because they feel uncomfortable and they want to get rid of that. And that is nothing on you and your grief.
Yeah.
So it's almost like you have to see that and recognize that so that you just let it wash over you and not be bothered by it because you have enough going on anyway.
Yeah. And there's been a lot like in my widow support groups where I think at first I even went through my own journey, like where that kind of stuff would trigger me. And then I would be like, what the hell? Like, and then I think when you're just fresh in grief and you don't, maybe it's the deepest grief you've ever experienced, you don't really, you might go through a process. Like we could tell you that now, but if you lost your person next week or whatever, you might be triggered by somebody saying one of those dumb things. And they're only dumb because they just don't know. They just haven't been there to experience that. So maybe their intention wasn't that. But I think as a person in grief, I was really bad at getting support from others. I was always somebody who could do this by myself and I'm going to handle this. And I still have my issues with that. But I will say that having other people that are going through the same thing, like a support group or people you could trust, will kind of help you work through that because they don't know. And I remember being triggered at the grocery store by the cashier as they were making like a joke about somebody who died. And it was like within a week of Joe passing away. And I'm like somebody who never like flips off the handle really. And I had to really, I think I just started crying and I was like, you should watch what you say around people. But in reality, like look at online and look at anywhere you go, like look at the movies you watch, like it's everywhere. It was me that was triggered. And so I had to go through my own bout of that. So give yourself grace if you have those moments. And like Anthony says, like it's something that you have to remind yourself they just don't know. And it's really not about you or what you're going on. You're just so sensitive to it in that moment. But that doesn't always happen overnight. And, that's kind of I don't know. What do you think, Carol?
I do feel like grief changes us in so many ways, right? And one of them is it changes your heart, changes the way you see the world, it changes the way you relate to people. And it might be for the better or for the worse. And for me at first, like you, I had my own grocery store episodes of wanting to scream. Now, I didn't do it, but I wanted to scream at somebody more than once. And why did you say that? It's media, movies, TV, books. I didn't realize before how prevalent death is and in an insensitive way in TV shows and movies and things like that. We get so used to it, video games. But when it became about me being in grief, those things like what could be very upsetting. And so I had to kind of rethink like how I perceived death, how I perceived grief or how I experienced grief. And it really just opened up my heart to people even more where I wanted to judge people less. I wanted to love people more, just whatever they were going through and not worry about what somebody else was doing, what else I was watching, but just kind of feeling about how am I acting towards other people. And so it's kind of that journey of being angry and grieving that kind of led me to be more open like that. And I don't want to say I was not a nice person before. I think I was. But I think I got nicer.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm talking about that because that's how I feel like grief relates to spirituality. So it changed me in that way and changed the way I looked at life, changed the way I looked at life after life, changed the way I looked at relationship, and also the understanding that we are all going through stuff every day
Yeah.
and we are all having our moments of needing support every day. And it just made me feel like we are more of a oneness than a separateness. So I will say, didn't want to go through that grief, don't want to do it ever again, and I wish I could take it away. But I do feel like I grew in that way, and I am glad that I've changed for the hopefully the better because of that.
I think that, well, both of you alluded to it as well, that like grief basically set you on journeys of self-discovery.
Mm-hmm.
Like you both evolved from the life situation that it was, and then that entailed, let's say, self-development.
Mm-hmm.
And I just have to add, because you were like, obviously, no one ever wants to go through grief, but it's always nice to remember it comes from a place of pure love.
Mm-hmm.
So, in other words, that the souls, had their understanding before they came here, and then knowing that one would experience grief, and yes, still agree to that experience and that life just out of pure love between the two souls originally. That's deep, and I
Mm-hmm.
always just try to remind myself of it, and that all of the suffering or any of the pain that we have here, the sadness, like it's just here. And it came from a place of pure love, and then where we go back is just pure love as well. That sadness won't be there. It's non-existent, so to speak.
Well, for me, that's that acceptance of, we are here for, it's about love. Uh, it helped me then want to honor my people during those special occasions, holidays, every day. It made me want to not see it as completely the worst time of my life when it's their birthday or their, I call it angelversary when they passed or whatever special holiday there is. It gave me a little bit of fuel to go, okay, I can get through this day and here's how I'm going to do it because I want to honor them and I'm not forgetting them and I want them to know it. I think everybody should have a Day of the Dead where we celebrate and honor our loved ones. I wish we had that here.
I also think grief can be something that people tend to compare, like, oh, they're losing their cat is not as important as me losing my husband or them getting a divorce. Like grief comes in so many forms, and we're all individual people, and we all have our experience with grief in some way, but it doesn't. Your experience is no worse than somebody else's, because then you start playing that game where we could say, well, at least we're not in another country being blown up, or you know what I mean? It just never ends. Like grief is such an individual journey. And so I think it's beautiful if you can get to a place in your own grief to where you can know that grief is universal and it doesn't make yours any more than or less than somebody else's, because I think that's what, on a spiritual level, goes back to the oneness and allows us to, as mediums and spiritual workers, to hold space for others, because, all our journeys in life are different. So the people will experience, everybody, it's part of being human, will experience grief. And I just am grateful to have that mindset, because I think it's really core to doing the work we do, to understand that everybody's different and their own level of pain or grief is their own experience that they've experienced.
Which is why you can't let anybody else tell you how to do it, how long to experience that, when it's time to, okay, just turn the switch off and now go back to your normal day to day. It's going to be individual. And because I see so many people in new grief, let's say, I see that probably about half of people want to immediately make some changes and they're looking and actively seeking for what can I do to get out of this grief? I can't stand it. What do I do? And other people can't even see that there's a possibility of moving out of the grief. So they just need to experience that for a while and allow themselves to experience that for a while. And they don't understand, they don't see the light just yet. And that's okay. We don't all have to move at the same pace, at the same speed, at the same time. If you don't feel like you can see that light at the end of the tunnel, then my recommendation is just take it more slowly. So it's a baby step kind of process. So the light is at the end of the tunnel. You will feel better one day, but just because you don't see it in front of you right then doesn't mean it won't happen. So just say, okay, well, I don't see the whole light at the end of the tunnel, but maybe there's the little flicker of a flame in front of me, and maybe I can reach that in whatever way you can reach it. So it's okay not to just suddenly wake up and one day, oh, great, I feel amazing, because it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
And I always say it's an ongoing process
It really is.
in the sense that you learn to live with
Mhm.
your life situation. It's not that you get over
Right.
the life
Yep.
situation, right?
Mhm.
There's a pattern there. Like Tracy even said, grief is universal. Like I can guarantee you, E.T. has experience of grief.
Mm-hmm.
It's like any form of being that comes from spirit where there's no sadness there or no sense of loss or grief. Like how can there be? Everything is eternal and existent,
Yeah.
right? But we come into these physical realities to have these experiences. So I've no doubt that it's universal, like you said, in the sense that go to another planet on the other side of the Milky Way, and there's also sadness there, and they're experiencing grief, whatever they're up to.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how they're coping with it, that's what I'd be asking if they landed. And I'd like, so tell me this.
Next week, more about alien grief.
I love it. I'm here for it.
So I call it coexisting with grief. I've learned to manage on a day-to-day basis. The grief is not gone. It's there, but I've managed to put it in its own space. And, it's the hole in the heart still going to be there, but it doesn't mean it has to be the whole of the heart is the whole. So just learning to navigate day-to-day situations, but allowing myself to, if I need to take a break right this minute, that's okay. Years later, it can still, it can hit you at any moment, right? That just a memory or something, or you drive by something that reminds you of your loved one, and all of a sudden it just makes you want to explode with grief. It's okay. That happens. And even though it catches us by surprise, it's not a bad thing. It's never going to go away. But the good thing is that you do learn to manage your day. You do learn to get through the day and the month and the year, and you do allow yourself to smile and have a laugh and have a joyful experience. And that's the coexistence, which kind of goes back to we're coexisting with our spirit, our loved ones who have passed. So it's kind of just a new way of existing with them versus the physical existence we had with them.
And the reality is, like, we're not going to just experience grief once in our lifetime. Like, we're all humans, so we're going to know friends that passed or animals, whatever it is, like, or, so that makes me think of what can we tell people who want to support their children, through grief? Because children are, I remember the first time somebody passed when I was a kid, it was, and I think as adults, when we're on this journey, there are things we can do to help children. And I think, Carol, you're really great to speak to this. I have adults, my children were adults when my spouse passed, but I think it's important to kind of insert something like that in this episode, because the one thing that I thought of immediately was, I know when my animals passed, I always took my kids with me, and we'd all, if we had to euthanize the pet, we would all go in there with them, because life and death, and we have a little ceremony. And they really value that now as adults. And obviously it's a little different when my spouse passed, and they were already well, my son was 12 when my first spouse passed, but he was 20 something when my second spouse passed. And I think there's tips we can give for parents to help children through grief, because it's often so confusing. And if we're in our own grief, what can you say to that, Carol?
What I found with my kids is they didn't necessarily want to address that. They don't want to have the conversations about it. They want life to go on as normal. My kids did anyway. And so it was really hard for me to give myself the space to, I'm not ready to go on with life, and I'm not going to be normal for a long time, but to support them with that. So I let them choose what they could handle. So if they needed a break from school, that's fine. If they needed to go to school and be with their friends as support, that's fine too. And for my kids, it was important for them to still celebrate the holidays because it was comfortable and familiar to them, and they didn't want to not have things as usual. And our loss was right before the holidays, before Thanksgiving and Christmas. So it was especially hard for me to put that together because I'm the mom. I put that stuff together.
Yep.
But a friend told me, and I was very grateful for this advice. She'd lost her child years before. And so she was in a phase of she'd learned to do her coexistence with the grief. And she said for her first holidays, she wanted to run away, just run away, which is what I wanted to do too. So they did. They went away somewhere else for a few years. And she said when she was finally ready herself to come back to, let's do it at home in the usual kind of ways, kids were so happy with that and so excited about it that she said she'd wish she'd done it earlier. So I took that into account and thought, okay, being the adult, I'm the one who can navigate trying to handle this change. They're the children. I don't want to change it for them too much if they can't. So we sat down and we kind of talked about it, and they told us what things, traditions they wanted to keep. And so I didn't make it the full, as usual, celebrations for Thanksgiving, Christmas, but we did do a lot of the things that were comfortable, a lot of the things that were familiar, and even started kind of one or two new traditions around it too, so that everybody got a little bit of comfort. Maybe everybody got some discomfort, but we found a way to make it happen for us so that it wasn't something that we would dread every year, but instead could say, okay, we can get through this.
Yeah, and I feel like kids, at least my kids, really appreciate like funny stories or like sharing pictures. Like they don't really know if they're supposed to, especially like my son losing his dad when he was 12. It's like, and that was complicated. We'll just say that in quotes. And so there was a lot of maybe negative things around some of it, but reminding him of like the positive, funny things like has really helped him, as he's an adult now. And so I think complicated grief is a whole other subject, obviously. And in some ways, it's all complicated to some degree, especially to a child. But really remembering what you love about that person and sharing that with kids, I've found is super helpful, especially if it's part of the close family. Like if in my son's case, that's his dad and, he's half of his dad. So hearing those things has been really beneficial, the funnier, lighthearted part. Or if it's like a sibling, then it's like reminds them that those memories aren't gone of the fun things they did together. I feel like that's also helpful for children and adult children. Anthony, as losing your father and you being the child, even though you're technically an adult most days anyway, can you add something to that for you being on that end of it?
Like, I was just thinking when my father died that, I mightn't have been very vocal about how I was feeling or anything like that, but I tend to be kind of private anyway, I keep things to myself in that regard. And that set me off, let's say, on a journey. So my father passed, obviously I'm very upset about that. And then my heart breaks as well, not just for me losing my father, but also like my siblings or my mother losing her husband, right? So there's different types of sadness within the grief. There's my own grief, but I'm also then extremely sad for like other members of my family. So then you come to terms with all that, and I'm just speaking then for me, like to come to terms with all that, I suppose, get logical. The useful thing to me there at the time, which, I kind of already had. So let's say before my father passed, and I wasn't into religion, God, faith, nothing, but I love science. And I love all the weird stuff and all of the kind of unusual, cool things that happen with quantum mechanics. And then suddenly my father passes, and then I remember all of that. It's like now I have all of these unanswered questions in science that, in theory, is telling me there's something more. And then it's almost like I found the door to the rabbit hole. But even like that, I remember going to my first circle. And a circle, for anyone that's listening that doesn't know, is what'll I call us? A group of like-minded individuals. It's just a circle of people that are sitting around, we'd say, and they're
developing
themselves spiritually. So we were doing like readings, like mediumship readings. And I remember in my first circle, like the first time my father ever came true. And then there's just random stranger sitting in front of me telling me things about my father. And then it's almost like I'm doing this new activity. I'm in this new setting with these random strangers. And yet here I have this familiar soul with me, which is my dad. So then let's say I'm in a circle and only in the month of either my sister's birthday or my mother's birthday will my father show up. And then he'll always reference some celebration. So now, without fail, always on those months that there's a birthday, whether it's my sister's, my mother, and there's someone to give a reading to me, he will pop in, and then I'll know that he's literally coming in to say happy birthday to whichever one it is. So like we have a new relationship, saying a new experience. Obviously, I still would give all of that up and have my father in the morning. But I'm just saying that the sadness is diminished there because now I feel like I have a new relationship with my father, right? So, and then I can't speak to, let's say, being in the deep trenches of grief in the same way that she might have been with losing a child or losing a spouse. But like we said, then you don't compare grief, or you
Right.
don't, you know. But like earlier on, but even Tracy alluded to it, there are different stages of grief and different levels of grief, I think, that people will be exposed to during their lifetime.
Right. Well, and it also depends on how emotional the relationship was. What was the connection between the two of you? I mean, that's going to factor into it as well. And then the expectations of we expect our grandparents to pass before us. We expect the elderly to pass. So it's not as shocking or surprising. We can still be sad about it, but in some kind of level, at least for me anyway, that happens. It's not quite the shock that when somebody passes before their time, let's say. And to me, that kind of adds another extra emotional layer to it when you didn't know that was coming. Or maybe it was somebody who was older, but you still didn't expect it. You know, there's, like you said, different kind of levels to it, but we're not to be compared.
I think my initial grief was, let's say, delayed because of shock, like you said there. So, you know, like my father only halfway through his life, I expect my parents to be around until their 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
And then when dad is suddenly gone halfway through, like that's a shock, you know? So if anyone was like, what emotion? It wasn't even sadness, it was shock.
Yeah.
Because suddenly he's there on a Monday, he's not there on a Tuesday, you know?
Yeah.
That's that surreal feeling Tracy was talking about earlier.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was talking about. It almost felt like, well, I couldn't feel anything. It was just shock, you know, and there's no timeline with that, you know, it's like different for everybody. I mean, you know, I had the wailing sounds that I've never heard myself make before, but I also had I didn't know what was what. And anything anybody said to me, it was just like a fog of what? Okay. You know, like no feeling. So it's just
So
different.
Tracy, you talked earlier about what can supporters do for those who are grieving. But what can we as grievers do for ourselves? You know, if you're the one in grief, what can you do for yourself to help yourself if you're ready to make some of those steps?
I mean, it sounds cheesy, but to not put pressure on yourself before, don't put pressure on yourself. Like, just be easy with yourself. If you can't get up and brush your hair one day, it's fine. To give yourself some grace, basically, is the biggest thing. And on a spiritual thing, you know, it really helped me to talk out loud. For me, I like to write. So I'll just write to Joe, or, you know, this is what I'm feeling. And yeah.
Well, and I'll talk out loud. You're a writer, but I'm a talker. So
Yeah.
I'll just talk out loud, or even in my mind, I just talk to my loved ones, and even right from the beginning. Do that. Have special pictures around them. Some people will have kind of a special area where they'll lay out their loved ones' favorite things. And, you know, everybody's going to have a different approach to that. But there are just simple little things we can do for ourselves to give us that comfort that our loved ones are there. Some people will make a quilt out of their loved ones' T-shirts. You know, it could be like that. So then they have a cozy little blanket to wrap up in. But on a day-to-day level, to me, it's okay to just sit down and take a break. And I know in the beginning, when I was fresh to grieving, if I just accomplished one thing in a day, that was enough. And it might have been brushing my hair. You know, it could be as simple as that. So I like what you said about just give yourself grace, take it easy on yourself, and know that there is a light at the end of the tunnel for everybody, even if you don't think you're in a space. We just want to encourage that for you because we've all found it. And if we can do it, anybody can do it. We're not any more special than anybody else in that sense. And we all approached it from our own angles and with our own experiences. So I encourage you just to know that, there is hope.
Yeah.
Well, I like that she both referenced almost reaching out to spirit, right, as a tool to help yourself as the griever. That you reached out, and Tracy, you do through writing and journaling is literally known for helping people like with self-development and stuff.
Yeah.
And then, so that's what I'm saying, two of you even doing it in your own way. So Carol, like you speak and Tracy might write, like it doesn't matter how you were doing it there, but two of you almost reached out to your loved one in spirit or spirit in some form or another to help yourself with that. And anyone can do that.
Anyone
Like you
can
don't
do
have
it.
to be a medium, like everyone's a medium anyway.
And, a lot of people around holidays too, they do seek out a medium. That's a time where they want to feel like extra closeness with their loved ones or around their birthday or their anniversary. And I did the same thing. I wanted that too. And I think that's a valid way to reach out as well if you're not confident enough in yourself to say, oh, well, I don't know if they'll hear me if I speak, or I don't know if they'll see what I wrote. They will, by the way, but it's also nice to treat yourself to having that experience with somebody helping you guide you through that connection.
Tracy's all talked out.
I don't think that's possible.
Tracy's just like, don't start me on a new thing now because we'll add 10 minutes to the episode.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of things about grief today, and there's so many more things that we could say about it. And maybe one day we'll continue with a part 2 in grief, but we hope we've given you some food for thought, and just know that you're not alone. You're not alone in your grief. You're not alone in your human self. You're not alone and away from the spirit world. They are all here with you. And we're going to wrap it up here. Thanks for listening to Etherealogy Podcast. And with that, we will say goodbye. See you next time.
Slán.
Bye. Anthony, I think you're going to have to explain slán because it sounds a bit like the American so long, but that's not what you're saying. What are you saying?
Yeah, I need to know.
Slán is just bye. It's Irish.
Okay.
But it's spell it for everybody.
SLA fada N, but you don't say fada.
It's just an accent mark.
I was going to say, need me go and check the proper word for the fada. I was like, I think it's an accent.
So SLAN. So it's kind of like so long.
I like it.